Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith.
Hi there. Before we start, Brian would like to share a couple of things with you. First, did you know that Brian is a life coach, a grief guide, and a mental fitness trainer? Brian would love to help you with whatever life issues are challenging you. Brian has years of experience as well as training. You can contact Brian at www.grieftogrowth.com to learn more. Brian is the author of the best-selling book, Grief to Growth, Planted, Not Buried, which you can get on Amazon or Brian's website. This is a great book if you're in grief or to give to someone you know who is dealing with grief. Lastly, Brian creates free and paid resources for your growth. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/gifts, www.grief2growth.com to sign up for his newsletter. Choose a gift just for signing up and keep up with what Brian is offering. And now, here's today's episode. Please enjoy.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. My name is Brian Smith. I am the host of the podcast Grief to Growth. Kelvin, Chen, and I have been friends for quite a while now, and I'm here to help Kelvin with this Q&A today. To Kelvin Chen, I'll introduce Kelvin first, and we'll talk about what we're doing, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Kelvin is an author. He's an afterlife expert. His first book is called Overcoming the Fear of Death Through Each of the Four Main Belief Systems, and it's a non-religious approach to overcoming the fear of death. His latest book is called Marcus Aurelius Updated, 21st Century Meditations on Living Life, and it's a collection of 67 essays ranging from emotions, life principles, meditation, and the spiritual. Now, Kelvin is the executive director and founder of the Turning Within Meditation and Overcoming the Fear of Death Foundations, and he's an internationally recognized meditation teacher featured in Business Insider, Newsweek, Kaiser Health News, and he's taught meditation at West Point and the U.S. Army, including in the DMZ zone in Korea. Kelvin's been meditating for 50 years. He's taught meditation for 49 years to thousands of people in over 60 countries. And his past life memories reach back 6,000 years. He's a graduate of Dartmouth, Yale, and Boston College Law, and he's lived in 7 countries. Now, Kelvin also organized the 30th November event held in Alexandria, Virginia in 2014. And that's where a talk was given by George Hammond, who gave the history of spirituality on earth in the Judeo-Christian Islamic Vedic traditions over the past 10,000 years, as shared in quite some detail with him by the founders of those traditions, who are all now, of course, on the other side. Now, today, as we're recording this, it's Wednesday, November 30th, 2022. This is the 8th anniversary of the talk that George gave. That talk was about 4 hours long, including Q&A. And Kelvin will give a brief overview of the talk, and we're going to have a Q&A today. Now, today we're using a platform called Riverside FM. You can actually interact with us. We're doing this live. You can type your questions into the chat. We'll be glad to take your questions when that time comes around. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Kelvin Chen.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to be here with you always as my friend and colleague in helping people understand life and death better. I guess that's our major overlap of our 2 Venn diagrams, yours and mine.
Yeah.
Helping people increase their happiness and reduce their suffering. I guess you and I would definitely, agree on that being our mission objectives, respectively, in our work. Thanks so much for moderating this today. As you said, it's the 8th anniversary of the 30th November talk that I helped organize in 2014. I'm going to just kind of do a brief overview, not as long as some of the preview interviews that I've done leading up to this Q&A today, because I want to really open it up to folks' questions sooner rather than later. But just a quick overview in case some of you who are watching this or are live here with us today had not yet watched the 30th November talk. So the 30th November talk is located at 30thnovember.com is the website address. But it's a talk that a friend of mine, George Hammond, gave in 2014. Basically, this is not the title of the talk, but just to kind of help you fast forward and understand what it was. It was basically background information on the start and why certain things were ideas were promoted by the founders of four major traditions, religious/spiritual traditions: the Judeo, Christian, Islamic, and Vedic traditions. So Judeo is Jewish, Christian, Christianity, and so forth. And you have Islamic and Vedic. And Vedic, for those of you who don't know, includes both Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. There's other offshoots of the Vedic tradition, but most of you probably have heard of Hinduism and Buddhism. So those major traditions, the source personalities of those traditions gave George a download directly in January of 2014. And as I said, the event happened where he shared the information about 10 or 11 months later in November of 2014. I'm going to take questions today about what was said there, but essentially there were several topical areas that were covered. So again, I'm not going to get into the details of this. If you haven't watched the talk, you should go watch the talk, and some of the Q&A that will come up in a few minutes will make more sense to you. But George kind of did an overview, first an introduction of how it came about and how he got the information from Jehovah, Jesus, John the Baptist, who was also Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in this 20th century lifetime. And he was also the prophet Elijah before he was John the Baptist. So that one personality, Maharishi, well, we do it in a chronological order: Elijah, John the Baptist, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, same personality. So we got Jehovah, Jesus, Maharishi, aka John the Baptist, Shankara, who was Vyasa in a prior lifetime. He was also the Greek philosopher Archytas in about 500 BC. So, and those of you who don't recognize Shankara or Vyasa's names, Vyasa wrote the Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita is part of the Mahabharata. He's considered one of the progenitors of what many people view as Hinduism and Buddhist ideas and so forth today. And Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, who was Maharishi's teacher, and there are 5 to 10 others in this core group, we'll call it. Okay, they call themselves the movement because 10,000 years ago, 7 to 10,000 years ago, ballpark, they started convening and on the other side and thinking about how could we help humanity move forward in a more positive direction, less killing, less sacrificing of women and children and men and human beings to the gods, animals, sacrificing animals, and all of that killing that was going on. How can we change that? So it started with the prophetic approach. George talks about that in the talk. Jehovah sending down, Jehovah, who is also known, by the way, as Yahweh in the Jewish tradition, Allah in the Muslim tradition, and many in the Christian tradition view Jehovah as God. Jehovah sent down prophets, and so George talks about the prophetic approach about, 4,000 years ago or whatever it was. And then there was the Jesus Project. And so George describes these different projects that was promoted, and he gives a little bit of a timeline, etc., in the 30th November talk. So he gives a little bit of explanation based on the information that was given to him by Jehovah, Jesus, and John the Baptist, and Shankara, and others, and so forth. in terms of their intention. What was their intentions? Why did they come up with this idea and that idea? Why were certain things done at certain times throughout human history here on planet Earth? So that's kind of an overview of the historical part, and then George gave ideas going forward in terms of the ideas that these members of what they call the movement on the other side, the spiritual movement, we'll call them on the other side, the ideas that they want to promote going forward to help us think a little bit differently in terms of our spirituality and how that might help us as humanity on planet Earth move forward in a more positive direction. So that was the idea behind the 30th November talk. So that's just kind of a quick overview. Again, I don't want to repeat the talk and so forth, but we'll get into ideas in the Q&A now. I want to open it up because I know that a number of you already have questions that you brought here, because many of you have communicated with me offline already. So let's just open it up to questions. And I guess, Brian, people what will they do? They'll type it in. Yeah.
You can type your question into the chat. So find your way to the chat box. I see that several of you have already. You can type your questions in. If you have any issues, let me know. AJ's already sent some questions to us, and I see. Yes. So AJ, I got AJ. I got your email. So why don't we go ahead and we'll start with AJ while everybody else is thinking of their questions.
And if they want to go on camera, they have an option. How's that work, Brian? With this platform?
Yeah, you can request to join the studio. You should have a button on your phone or your computer to request to join the studio. You will need to enter your question in there before it will allow you to put that through. I'll take a look at it. Kelvin and I were talking about this earlier. We don't make sure we don't get bombed by anybody. So make sure you put a question in that makes reasonable sense if you want to come on camera. But let's start with AJ's questions. So AJ says, as a spiritual reporter, I have 3 questions I'd like to ask you regarding free will and the world's spiritual evolution. In the 30th talk, George Hammond defined life as a free will action, explained that free will is the most important thing here that people have. Also, in a recent IANS talk, you mentioned that according to the movement, planet Earth is a place where everyone has free will and that some people incarnate here seeking progress while others only seek mundane pleasures and do whatever they like, even if it means committing crimes, hurting or killing others. So the first question is, are all humans, both incarnated and disincarnated, here on Earth and also in the afterlife, divided into these 2 groups?
So I would say, first of all, AJ, there are no groups. We are humanity, and not just humanity, but every mind, whether it's on this side or the other side, whether it's on planet Earth or another planet, hypothetically, where there's other beings with conscious minds existing, we all have free will to make different choices. But there's no groups of people who are good people and bad people. I mean, I'll just self-disclose to you, AJ, I've not been a perfect person my entire life. I've done some bad things, in my life that I feel badly about, how I broke up with a girl. I mean, I can still remember, breaking up with her on the phone. And when I was 19 years old, 20 years old, when I was in college, it wasn't a very sensitive way to do that, okay? And do I have regrets about doing that, AJ? Yeah. I wouldn't do it the same way now. So life is a learning process for all of us, nobody is. There's goodness and badness, you could say, if that's a word, in everybody. So I want to discourage people from thinking that there's this notion that somebody is all good or somebody is all bad, and that there's groups of people. So we all have different choices that we make, and when we're making those choices, typically, most people are making those choices because they think that choice will make them happier at that moment. Now, will that choice that they make somebody else very unhappy? Maybe even hurt another person at that other person's expense by making that initial person happier. Yeah, that happens. And we consider those things bad actions, right? Or and we look at those people and we say, hey, that's a bad person. But maybe it's a bad choice that they make, but it's not a matter of groupings, okay? I want to discourage people from thinking about levels or groups of people, that everybody is this way or everybody's that way. I don't know if that helps, AJ. You can follow up on this, but is there more to this, Brian?
Yeah, he does have a couple of questions. I like to follow up on it, and then we'll talk
Go
about
ahead.
his second question, because
Yep.
I think this is an issue that, in traditional religion, a lot of religions, it's like, I'm just going to say Christianity because that's where I grew up in. There's this idea that God planned our lives.
Right.
And now in the New Age movement, the spiritual movement, there's this idea of soul planning, that we have a purpose, that we've come in with a plan, and everybody has a plan, and Earth is a place of learning. I think that might be what AJ's kind of coming up against. And I know this is a issue I was just discussing on Facebook this morning with some people, because they get very bothered if you say that we're not all here for a purpose.
Yeah, well, I'm going to bother them then, because we're not all here for a purpose. Everybody's here for whatever reason they're here for. And everybody, excuse me, everybody decides whatever they want that purpose to be or not. There may be people here who, as AJ said, I think he used the phrase, I scribble down notes when people are asking me questions so I cover certain things. He used the phrase mundane. People may be here for very mundane purposes. They may just come back here for the soft serve ice cream, I say, or getting drunk, or having sex, and that is their choice. Spiritual people or people who are thinking more consciously may not like that, but that's not your choice to make of what other people are doing. And judging other people, I discourage people from that. And this is one of the 30th November messages, is to not judge people. I mean, can you live your own spiritual life more spiritually regardless of what somebody else is doing? To me, that's where the rubber meets the road, okay? Now, if you're walking around in life thinking, oh, I cannot have a happy life because look at those neighbors down the road and what they're doing, well, then you're going to be miserable your whole life forever and eternity, because there's always going to be somebody who's doing something that you don't like. Maybe it's even something minor. It's not that they just leave their trash out all over their front lawn. Maybe it's they park their cars crooked, and that bugs you. And now you're all over them because they park their cars crooked, or they're 2 feet away from the curb instead of, what is it? I don't know what the law is. 16 inches, 18 inches, or whatever it is. And that pisses you off. It's not that they're leaving garbage in the street or whatever, or really causing a health hazard. It's just because they're not doing something that you don't like. What if somebody meditates every day and you don't? And you think it's a waste of time, and you really think that going to church is the way to be a spiritual person. And they don't go to church. Maybe they don't even meditate. But maybe they treat people in a loving way, with the way they live their lives. And maybe they haven't been to church since they were 5 years old. Or maybe they've never been to church or temple or synagogue or whatever, pick, a religious path. It's like, the issue is, can we live our own lives spiritually regardless of what anybody else is doing? And my answer, and the answer from the 30th November talks, is absolutely yes. And here's a follow-up to it. Can we create a wonderful society worldwide on planet Earth where people are kind to each other, hypothetically? Let's just take this way down the road, AJ. And let's say that, I know that from offline conversations, you have a wonderful intent to try to create a peaceful world. I have the same intent as well, objective. But is our happiness based on whether or not that happens or not? That's a problem if it is. Because think about it big picture. Let's say, AJ, we are successful, and we have created a world of peaceful humans. Are we going to be upset by how the tigers and lions are tearing the gazelles apart, or whatever, or how cruel the insects appear to us because the choices that those minds are making? Because we tend to think of in such an what's the word,
Anthropomorphic.
anthropomorphic, whatever. Say that 5 times fast. We think of ourselves just, human centric. Humans. The humans are the only ones who have minds. No, animals, insects. I mean, I don't know where you want to draw the line, but at some point, there's a lot more than just human minds on planet Earth. There's 8 billion of us. So imagine trying to get control over 8 billion minds who all have free will choices. I think it's not the path to happiness to try to control other people's minds, because they will always have that free will, as we say, right?
Yeah. So let me ask AJ's second question.
Yeah.
So if the afterlife is always going to be divided into these two groups that he mentioned, one that has a purpose, a higher purpose, and one that's more, quote, mundane, does that mean that these two groups will never end, that humanity is deterministically doomed to never awaken spiritually as a whole?
So, first of all, I don't think there's any such thing as humanity waking up as a whole. As we just said, there's always going to be some minds who are making different choices from you. I mean, just look at it from a political, an educational standpoint. Take it out of the spiritual realm. I mean, every mind is always going to have a different perspective on raising a child, for example. Now, how you raise a child and how you speak to your child and so forth, and what guidance you give them or don't give them, how are you going to control that? I mean, it's impossible to control, and I would argue that it's not healthy to control other people, because what you're doing is, and this, fast forward to the end of the 30th November talk when George was running out of time, and for those of you who heard the end of the talk, he thought he was going to go 2 hours and he went 3 hours, and that was before the Q&A. So, because, I was waving my hands around trying to get his attention. He couldn't see us. The lights were so bright, and there were 5 cameras. The brights he couldn't see anything, couldn't see any of us in the audience. So he just touched lightly on this cruelty idea. So the more you control other minds to do something that's against their free will choice, the more you make them miserable. And the more miserable you make somebody, the more likely you increase the chances of them being a cruel person. Because cruelty is based on what? Cruelty is based on, first of all, what's cruel? What's cruel behavior? Cruel behavior is when somebody does something to make themselves feel better and it hurts other people. Basically, they kind of like hurting other people. I think we would agree that's what cruelty is, okay? Cruel behavior. Well, why does the cruel person do what they do? They do what they do because they want to be happy, just like you and I and everybody. We all want to be happier. Well, if the cruel person is feeling real miserable, what's the fastest, best way in their minds? Not the best way, but what's the fastest way for them to feel better? Bully people around them, depress people around them, make other people feel like you know what around them, and they feel better. That's the quick fix for the cruel person. They bully other people, they feel better, okay? They depress other people around them, they do cruel things to them, they make them feel bad, they call them names, they hurt them physically or emotionally, and they feel better. So, you see, if we go down this road of control, which is what you're talking about, Brian and AJ, this idea of, if people want to start going down this idea of control, it has a really, really bad side effect. And Jehovah has seen this, and he's pointing this out now as part of the 30th November talk. And the word he's using, he didn't use this in the 30th November talk when George was talking, but Jehovah has come to me And he wants us to use the word dangerous. That controlling others to do stuff that they don't want to do, especially from a spiritual standpoint, is dangerous because he now sees that it creates several things. It creates this cruelty notion that we just talked about, but it also creates, if you're controlling people by saying you have to believe in me, I am your God, your guru, your master, and you follow blindly whatever I do, that kind of devotional mentality creates, that blind devotion will create a blind devotional pathway in the neurosynaptics of that human mind, and that human mind will then be taught to go blindly follow other people who may be cruel, and it will cause that blind follower to be abused, and eventually, if it's so deeply ingrained in that person to be they call it bhakti, is a bhakti yoga, devotional yoga in the Vedic tradition. You even have a word for it. And it's so devotional, and it's not just Vedic, but this is worldwide, whatever tradition or whatever spiritual teaching you want to go to, doesn't matter if even it's a tradition. It could just be Joe Schmo or Josephine so-and-so spiritual teacher saying this. You follow them blindly, that creates a devotional blind following pathway in your neurosynaptics, and you'll follow somebody who will beat you and be cruel to you emotionally, and Jehovah sees this now as being a dangerous thing, not blind following, and then the cruelty element, arises because of the manipulation and the controlling. Yeah,
and we've seen that in cults.
Yeah.
So AJ's third question is, if so, what is the point of promoting the world's spiritual progress and evolution, like Jesus and Maharishi did, among many others, if the outcome has already been predetermined and will not change no matter what we or the movement do?
So I don't understand where AJ gets this idea that the outcome's predetermined. Where's he getting the predetermination here? I don't know if AJ wants to follow up with this. Brian, you can explain to me.
The way I would interpret this is and I think this comes back to humanity being enlightened as a whole. So I think what AJ is saying is there's always going to be some people doing their own thing, being mundane, whatever. Therefore, we'll never all be enlightened as a whole. So then what is the point of the movement?
I would say, AJ, have you ever been in a family situation where, let's say a child is crying, really upset, and nobody's paying attention to the kid who's crying, Thanksgiving, Christmas, some holiday, whatever, some family gathering, and yet you go over to help that child, to comfort the child. Why do you do that when nobody else is doing it? Why do you do that? I think I would do it for two reasons. I would do it to help the child feel a little bit better. And I do it because it makes me feel good to help another being. The fact that everybody else, the other 25 people in the room or 30 people in the room in the family gathering, are not paying attention at all to this 2 or 3-year-old kid who's crying in the corner is immaterial to me. I don't do things in life because of some outcome that's socially going to be applauded by a large number of people, or that's even going to be experienced by a large number of people, quite frankly. I help people who want to be helped. So wouldn't that be a reason enough alone for the movement, who have such loving and giving hearts and minds to help humanity? Why would they think, AJ, oh, we're not going to bother with humanity if we can't, if everybody's not going to, move forward in a positive direction? We'll just move on to another planet, where we can get everybody to move on in a positive direction. No, what kind of kind of being is that? What kind of person would I be in that family to just see that 3-year-old child crying hysterically in the corner and just letting them be because nobody else is helping them, so I won't help them either. I don't understand that. I mean, you can help me understand more that there's no predetermination here. I mean, the fact that predetermined means everything is planned out and nobody has any free will. So maybe we need to define what predetermination means, because people maybe don't understand that. I mean, destiny and predetermination means that everything is absolutely planned out. You have no free will choices. Nothing is changeable. Nothing can be improved. Everything is it's already set in motion, and you're just a puppet in a play, in a theater, and there's no choice. That's what free will, that's what determinism means. That's what destiny means. Now, if people want to use destiny in a very loose way, like, oh, Brian, you and I were destined to meet because, look, we're doing this similar work and we're helping each other and so forth in our respective work. That's loosely, you can use destiny in that way. Okay, fine. That's like, oh, there's a connection, and this is, who knows, was somebody whispering on the other side into our ears, and hey, you should meet this guy Kelvin, you meet this guy Brian. Maybe. Okay, fine. But that's not destiny in the sense of it was absolutely meant to be and nobody can change that. That's what destiny means, and that's what predetermination means. So movement sees planet Earth and says, hey, we can help humanity. Let's do what we can to help humanity. It's a social science experiment, essentially. If they looked at it from your perspective, AJ, then they would have said, forget about it. Why bother? No, they said, no, let's do what we can, and let's see what we can do, and let's adjust it. And that's the 30th November talk that George gets into, of how Jehovah and Jesus and others adjusted things. Jehovah moving from what we now know, India, and he did the Jehovah experiment and the Jesus project and so forth, in what we now know as the Mesopotamia, Middle East region. Okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Does that help?
I'd like to interject something here, because someone asked in the chat a little bit later on, is AJ confused? And I don't think AJ is confused. These are some pretty big concepts that are contrary to a lot of things that we've been taught in the past. And sometimes it's taken me, I listened to the 30th November talk a couple of years ago. I listened to it again this week. And these are some mind-blowing concepts, because there are people that think that we are all going to one day be enlightened, that when we all cross over into heaven, for example, that we're all going to be of one mind and there will be no more conflict and there will be no more disagreements. And that's a hard thing for some of us to wrap our heads around. The fact that we're not all here to learn, that we're all not here with some big plan. So let's give people like AJ a little bit of a break, because I think these questions are questions that we all have.
Yeah, no, AJ is a very thoughtful person. So, I mean, I'll stick up for AJ because he and I have had some offline conversations separately. But yeah, so, AJ is a very thoughtful person. And these, as Brian said, these are very deeply rooted beliefs that's why the 30th November talk is such a big deal, quite frankly, people, because it is, you'll say, sticking a little bit of, explosives in there to kind of loosen some of those rocks that have been so deeply embedded in people's belief systems. I'm mixing metaphors here, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. It's just so deep that it's difficult for people to get their minds around. And I respect that. I get that. And so you'll hear me, Kelvin Chin has been asked this question a number of times, and I try to answer it from different approaches, different angles, to see maybe that different approach might sink in. And I really appreciate your helping translate some of these, Brian, because I've been working on this for thousands of years, and so, it can take a while. We need to be patient with ourselves. But The point is that, bottom line, and we'll go to the next question in a sec, but the bottom line is, we want to improve the quality of life of ourselves and as many others as possible who are interested in improving their lives. So that's the way I look at it. I'm not here to sell people on improving their lives. And George says this right at the beginning of the 30th November talk. Those of you who haven't seen it yet, he says, take what take what works and shelve the rest. And I tell people the same thing. I've been saying this for thousands of years to my students, that you take what works, what resonates, and you put aside what doesn't. And then you may never pull it off the shelf, or you may pull it off the shelf 6 months or 6 years later or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's up to you. We are all on eternal journeys figuring stuff out. Nobody has everything figured out. That's another message of the 30th November talk. And it seems like we're all eternal beings. Souls, consciousness, whatever you want to call ourselves, individual minds for eternity, figuring stuff out. And so why not, the way I look at it is, why not help ourselves by helping each other figure these things out, which is why I do what I do, because you, my students, those of you who have already taken classes with me, you know I've said this to you at different times. I learn more from you, because you'll ask me a question and I'll think, okay. And it makes me pause and reflect. I'm learning all the time too. So I think that's true for many of us. Again, those of us who choose to learn.
Well, that leads to the next question. Someone says, the 30th November points out that God is not all-knowing or all-powerful. What does that mean for prayer? Are divinities impotent to cause changes in our lives if they're not all-powerful and all-knowing? And the follow-up is, what does the house always mean when it comes to prayer?
Oh, the house always wins me. It means because it's the gaming. It's like a referral to the casino. It's like a George thing. It took me a while to figure out what he meant by that too, to be honest. So if you don't feel badly, if you're like, and look, George and I go way back 4,000 years. And so I'm still trying to get, I can understand 90% of what he's saying, but sometimes he'll throw in some of these jokes. I call them these Samuel Clemens type jokes where I kind of go, wait, is that a joke? Are you being serious? Or oh, that was a joke. So that is referring to casinos. They always know. The house always wins, right? Those of you who don't know, if you don't know that, that's why you always lose money when you're going to a casino. They got it figured out in the gambling business. So people, they're always gonna they can give you all those free meals, for a reason because they're making tons of money. Trust me. But the idea with prayer is the notion that you can be told whatever is the thing is that you could pray for something and then you could be told, oh, well, that happened and so forth. In other words, you can always have a justification for whether or not your prayer was answered or not answered. People will come up with a reason when it's not answered for why God didn't hear you. So the bottom line with prayer is that, to answer the main part of that question, is that is it valuable to pray? So first of all, it depends what you mean by prayer. So there's prayer, meaning just turning within and connecting with oneself, and then there's prayer, meaning asking for stuff. Okay? So I think the person is asking about the latter. So is it valuable to ask for stuff if God is not, if Jehovah, who many people view as God, is not omnipotent and omniscient? The short answer is maybe, maybe not. It depends on you. But so you can still get answers to your prayers because Jehovah or Jesus or Buddha or your dead grandmother or an angel on the other side your friends, in other words. When you hear me use the word friends, that I'm including all those beings, okay? It's a general catch-all phrase that I use. Friends can still hear you and help you from the other side. They may not be able to control everybody on this side or the other side, but can they influence? Yes. So it's kind of like, is it valuable for you to call up your friend Brian here? For me to call up my friend Brian and say, hey, Brian, I need your help on something. Yeah. It's to me, that's like a prayer, except it's not, I'm not closing my eyes. I'm picking up my smartphone and I call Brian. Okay. So I think we need to think of our friends. That's why they use that word friendship in 30th November, right? We want to think of them more as our friends than our divine beings or gods or gurus or whatever. More as our friends. And so can you ask friends for help? Sure. And so if you're looking at prayer from that lens, sure, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, okay? Now, if you're looking at it as an absolute, that's what an underlying message is of the 30th November talk, is to not look at prayers as, well, I prayed to God and he said, I would win the Super Bowl bet and I lost. So obviously God didn't listen to me, and then you get angry at God. No, that would be a misunderstanding of your friend on the other side who you're calling God. All right? Because Jehovah doesn't have control over every single mind in the universe, never mind in planet Earth, doesn't have control over every mind on planet Earth either. Okay? Because each mind is a free will thinking mind. Cannot control them. Look, he could not control the crucifixion of Jesus, they're like soul father and son. They're not biological. Jesus had a father and a mother and so forth biologically. But they're like soul connected, as if a father and son, Jehovah and Jesus. He couldn't control Jesus not being crucified. He was crucified because of the free will choices of thousands of people at that time. So look at them more as our friends, and you can pray to them in that regard. I don't know. Does that answer the question, I hope?
I think it does, but it's interesting because, again, it comes back to this big concept, because we've identified Jehovah as God, and we've identified God in traditional Christianity anyway as omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnipotent. That God can do anything and knows everything. So I think the question is like, well, if what we're calling God doesn't really know everything, then how much power does this being have? And it reminds me what George in the talk mentioned, that Jehovah gave the land to the Jews. Yeah. And then he said he gave it back to the Jews. And that caught my ear, because it's like, did he give the land to the Jews, and how did he do that?
Yeah, so that exactly. I heard that again. I was listening again to the talk for about the 15th or 20th time this morning at the end, and I heard that too. And could Jehovah be influential enough to make that happen? Yes. So yeah, he's powerful. Yes, he has influence. Just look in your own lives, okay? All of you who are watching or listening to this, in your own lives, do you know some people who are more influential than other people? Of course you do. And some people are really influential, okay? And so Jehovah is one of those people. He's very influential. But does he choose to interfere with people's free will all the time? No, he does not. He respects people's free will, okay? Mm-hmm. But he's not omnipotent and able to control everything. That's what omnipotent means, okay? But that doesn't mean that he can't be very, very influential. Just like some of the people who are very, very influential. Are they omnipotent? No. But can they control a lot? Yeah. Okay?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Next question is, if one life after the other is a kind of a school, and the soul learns things along the incarnation, how is this learning taken over to the next life? Does the soul change by learning phases, incarnations?
So the bottom line is that our soul, or our personality, I call it, it's an aspect of our soul. So when in my afterlife class, in the 6th session of my 6-part series, I talk all about this. But the short version is that I consider our soul eternal. I consider that and when I say soul, my individual, not Kelvin Chin, you see here on this call right now, not Kelvin Chin, but there's a soul part of Kelvin Chin, my individualness there, that's individual, that is unique to me, that continues for eternity. One, like a layer up from that, we could say, one step up from that, is my personality, which continues. Now, I'm going to talk about this in my 3rd book. I'm still trying to work through and finish this 3rd book, which I talk about my personalities continuing over the last 6,000 years, and I give examples. All right? So that's what continues from lifetime to lifetime, to answer this person's question. Mm-hmm. Can we learn from lifetime to lifetime? Yes. So it is possible, and I choose to. Now, you can make that choice. So that's my teaching point to in my classes and to all of you right now, is to make that choice, to learn. Not everybody chooses to. Some people, like we said, they're, like AJ referenced in this first question, are just very mundane about coming back, and it's okay. Some people just want to come back and goof around. Yeah, and they come back. Look, you got thousands and thousands, arguably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of chances, And the other thing about this coming back thing and reincarnation idea concept is that you don't have to come back. You can hang out on the other side and just vacation for a long, long time. I've hung out there for hundreds and hundreds of Earth years, sometimes thousands of years. So just hanging out. You don't have to come back, but you can choose to come back, and people choose to come back. They're not forced to come back. There's no cosmic system that makes you come back and learn lessons or figure out correct some bad deed you did, unless you want to come back and correct that. Okay.
Well, I think this is a common question when people are introduced to the idea of reincarnation. It's like, well, if I've forgotten everything I knew before, am I not starting from a blank slate? What's the point?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think that there's a couple of things there. One is that it seems like a blank slate, but it's not really a blank slate. There are emotional patterns, I call them, emotional patterns that are wired into us when we are born. And those of you who have paid attention to your newborn babies, my newborn babies are not newborn anymore, but that's 28 and 34 years old. But I was paying attention when they were born, and you could see their personalities being very different from each other, very different from their mom and their dad, me and their mom. And there's wiring there. There's emotional patterns, there's personality, and there's emotional patterns. And so we think we come in with a blank slate. It's like, relatively speaking, I understand the expression, but we're not a blank slate, really. We have a personality. There's initial wiring there. There's emotional patterns. Some kids are real easy, just from an infant standpoint. Some of them aren't. And you'll see that pattern tend to repeat, not always, but often through their lives. Okay? Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect. The other thing is, in terms of this question, is I don't think it's always a good thing to remember everything that you did before. I don't think first of all, I think it's a waste of time. Just think about this lifetime. You just forget about past lives. Just think, do you remember every bite of food that you ever took? In your, however you're old, Brian, you look a lot younger than you are. We won't say your age, but those decades. You don't remember every bite of food. Do you remember how many steps it took for you to walk, to school every day? There's all these things that are a complete and utter waste of time to remember. Not only that, but there are things in our lives which maybe it's better off that we didn't remember, because it might have been scarring and hurtful. And we still may have that scar, but is it good to kind of keep bringing that up? And so if you think about that in the context of past lives, it applies there too. And I think we all have a self-regulatory, I call it a self-regulatory mechanism in our own individual consciousnesses, each of us as individuals, that kind of screens out stuff that maybe we don't need to remember how we died that lifetime, because maybe it was pretty horrific in that previous lifetime. Why dig up all that stuff? But again, I'm a going forward perspective, pragmatic looking guy. So looking forward, how can we improve our self-development and know more about who we are, which is what I think our eternal lives are all about, unfolding more of who we are. We can look at our emotional patterns. We can look at our fears and our desires. Those three things, and they're interrelated, right? We look at our fears, desires, and our emotional patterns, and what drives us. What are these kind of innate, almost like stuff that we're born with? And can we relieve the pressure valve on some of the negative stuff and improve the going forward, improve and strengthen the positive stuff for us going forward? That's the way I look at all of that.
Yeah, and it's something interesting to ponder, because the other thing about this Earth experience, for most of us, we're totally immersed in it because we do not remember anything about our past lives, and I think that's part of the plan when we come in. I've heard a guy, his name is Christian Sundberg. He gives a really fascinating between life memory, where he remembers the veil going on as he was coming in. It's part of, I think it's part of the process of incarnating for again, for most of us. Some of us, those memories come back for most of us, they don't.
Yeah, and it's not a structural thing. It's a mental thing that he's describing.
Right.
And that was his experience, which is maybe very different from everybody else's experience. That's a major teaching, is that everybody's experience is individual. So when we hear experiences like that, many people would hear that and go, "Oh, so somebody puts a veil on."
Yeah, that was a metaphor. Yeah.
Right, it's a metaphor. So we
Right.
need to be careful of those things. I know you didn't mean it that way, but I'm just saying from a teaching standpoint, I hear these things and I go, "Okay, that's accurate for Christian." And it's very accurate for him. And it's probably accurate for most people, I'd say. But it's their own mind doing it. That's why I think of these things as self-regulatory. That's why I use language like that. Yeah.
Yeah, great point. Jody points out, I think somewhere in the talk, George said that Jehovah did not deify himself. That other people did that. Well, Exodus 6:3 states that he did, in fact, deify himself. And I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob by the name of God Almighty. But my name, Jehovah, was I not known to them.
Right. And so those biblical verses, Jehovah is saying were, how do I say this gently? Exaggerations, interpretations by humans of stuff that he may have said. So Jehovah denies that he ever held himself out as God. Now, that said, he allowed himself to be perceived that way for many thousands of years. And he is now, as of 30th November, and then since then, as you know, you've been to some of my classes where he's poked his head in sometimes in my classes and said he wants me to emphasize that he's not seeing that, he doesn't see himself that way, but he also is okay with people who still want to view him that way. He's not here to change people's beliefs. Just like I've said, George said at the beginning of his talk, and I'm saying at the beginning of many of my talks, I'm not here to change people's beliefs, and Jehovah isn't either. So if people still believe that he is capital G God, that's their free will choice. But he's saying that he doesn't view himself that way, and he has not viewed himself that way. And whatever you cite from the Bible is stuff that some human being misinterpreted, he would say, and or exaggerated and wrote down. So
Well, I wanted to interject there too, because people will take the Bible as being written by the finger of God, and it wasn't. It was written by men.
Exactly.
So I think we always have to keep that in mind when we say, okay, well, here's are Jehovah's literal words. No,
Yes.
that was someone's interpretation. And I would imagine if we saw a being or experience a being as powerful as that, and we're living in the Bronze Age, that's God. That's the creator of the universe.
Absolutely. I mean, you just look at how many NDEs that you and I have heard people tell. So many. You and I collectively probably have heard hundreds of NDE stories. Okay, in your podcast and so forth, Brian, and in my work. So I mean, you go to the other side, and it's this being of light who feels very loving and powerful, and then tells you stuff about yourself that you forgot or didn't even know. Doesn't that sound like God to you? That's why so many people who have NDEs say they spoke to God. Maybe they spoke to Jehovah, maybe they didn't. Because Jehovah isn't the only powerful being on the other side. It's not like there's one. There's many. Okay? And Jehovah happens to be the one who's been paying a lot of attention to planet Earth. Right?
Yeah.
But there are many, and you could run into any of them on the other side. You're not just going to run into Jehovah or Jesus or Maharishi, a.k.a. John the Baptist, or whoever, Shankar, etc. There's millions of beings on the other side, and there's probably hundreds of thousands of them are very, very powerful. So we need to, this goes to another teaching point that, again, this comes out of 30th November, that wasn't explicitly said, but it's very, very strongly implied, is that we do not just follow power. We look at what's wisdom, not just follow power. All right? So a powerful being does not necessarily have your best interests at heart. Right? So is it useful? So I'm a pragmatist. I like to use pragmatist words. Like, is it practical and useful information for me going forward, and does it make sense? That's Kelvin Chin language, okay? That's how I distill all this stuff down from a less philosophical to a more daily pragmatic, language. Useful, practical, does it make sense? Okay, I'll listen. And then maybe I'll follow it, maybe I won't, but I'll listen. I still got to make a decision myself. That's the way I look at these things. But power, so many people are blown over by power, whether it's money or light being, money on this side, or or status on this side, on this side of the veil, or on the other side of the veil, light, a light being that felt so powerful and so loving. That's great. I'm not discounting that. I'm just saying, still make up your own mind, right?
I have to bring this up. I was just discussing with someone yesterday about God and the Bible and eternal damnation. And I was debating with this guy that this makes absolutely no sense to me. And he basically came back with, well, if God says it, then who am I to question it? And that goes back to that blind devotion that you talked about at the very beginning, that Jehovah is now saying is so dangerous. Yes. Because we do have that mindset that if a being this powerful said something, then it must be right because that being is so powerful.
Right. Yeah, he's really underscoring that, and he actually wanted me to put that word on one of my PowerPoint slides, and I'm like, really? He said, yeah, really. So dangerous, because it makes people susceptible to being hoodwinked by somebody who is not as loving and kind as Jehovah, right? So it may have worked for you with Jehovah, but what if it's somebody else? And it creates this neurosynaptic pathway that he realizes now in the person, in the human mind. Creates a neurosynaptic pathway of devotion, devotion, devotion. Next thing you know, they're devoted to somebody who's abusing them, and they can't figure out how to get out of it because they're so wired to be devoted. And then all of these machinations come out in their mind, and it's just like you mentioned the word cult, Brian, and it's just it's there's all this, what do they call that? The Sweden, the Copenhagen
Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just like they're protecting the bank robbers who were abusing them and held them at gunpoint because they just, the mind gets all mishmashed. And Jehovah has seen that this is happening over the last 10,000 years. And he's now come out 30th November 2014 saying, don't do that. Don't do that. Free will thinking mind, question everything, including everything that look, when George called me on January, whenever it was, let's say it was January 3rd or 4th. I think his sister died, January 3rd, 2014. And he called me right away that night, right after he got this 90-minute download, which then turned into an 11-month download that he got, and I got more information, and several of us got more information that was added to the 30th November talk. But he called me right away. The next day, he told me what happened. The next day, we talked to each other and said, okay, well, what are we doing about this? Are we going to do this or not do this? We decided. We didn't just follow what this person, Jehovah, whatever, and Jesus and everybody. And George really felt that this was a real experience, okay? If you haven't seen the 30th November talk, you should watch it because he talks about what it felt like biologically, physically, in his body to hold Jesus in Maharishi John the Baptist's hands, okay? Anyway, so I said, okay, so this seems real to you, George? And he goes, yeah. See, because I'm a questioner. I'm a skeptic. I'm questioning. I don't just blindly follow. So I said to George, okay, let's assume that these beings are who they say they are. That's what I said. This is the day after he called me, okay? This is January 4th, let's say, 2014 or something like that. And I said, let's just assume that. Do we want to do what they want us to do? So let's think about that. And so, he and I talked about that, and whether we wanted to do it. So we didn't just do it because we were asked to do it. So not only that, but over the next 10 months, I would get information, and we would add stuff in, and I say, George, there's no way. We're not saying that. No, we're not saying that. No, 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 no. And I'll tell you something, this group right now, this little group here, I'll tell you one of the things that we decided not to say. One of the things Jesus was very upset about and expressed very explicitly, and he's repeated this to a number of us, not just George and not just me, but others as well, since the 30th November talk in 2014. He wanted this in the 30th November talk. Fortunately, George, he and I decided beforehand that, no, we're not putting this in because it would have been too upsetting to people. Jesus wanted it expressed that the whole notion of him being crucified was not part of Jehovah's plan. All right? And I talk about this, as you know, Brian, in my classes now very explicitly, but this Jesus Project, and it was not part of Jehovah's plan to have Jesus crucified. This whole notion that Jesus died on the cross to save everybody for sins, that was Paul. Paul created that. And Paul created that he never met Jesus. Now, this is factually stated in the Bible, but most people haven't even read this part of the Bible. They just think that somehow Saint Paul was, they called him the Apostle Paul. He was never part of Jesus's apostles. So the church calls him the Apostle Paul. Okay, the church created Paul, the apostle. All right, the Christian church did that. So Paul never met Jesus. He never spoke with Jesus. He was never in Jesus' physical presence. He was never at a lecture that Jesus gave. He came on the scene 3.5 years after Jesus was murdered on the cross. Paul came up with this whole idea that Jesus died on the cross to save people for his sins and so forth. That really bothers Jehovah, and it really bothers Jesus. Okay? So this was something that was asked to be brought up in the talk. But the part that was left out, and probably George, if he had more time, he might have brought that up a little bit in the talk. Mm-hmm. But the part that was really, we decided we're not going to talk about, is Jesus' request that people take down crucifixes of him. And we said, dude, I mean, they're like how many hundreds of millions, probably, I don't know, tens of millions of crucifixes there are around the world. How upsetting that's going to be to people. And he said, well, at least take down the ones where he's bleeding in agony on because it was physically painful for him. It reminds him of the physical pain. Did he suffer? No. Physical pain and suffering are two different things. He didn't suffer. Mentally, he didn't suffer, but it was incredibly painful, and it's a bad reminder. We don't forget these things, people, okay? Yeah. Somebody is cruel to us, we don't forget. We can forgive and move on, but we don't forget. We never forget, okay? So he remembers that, and he said, he gave George the analogy. He said, you can say this in the talk, which we decided not to, but he said, you can tell people, all the women out there who have had babies, natural childbirth, would you put pictures of yourself and the baby as the baby's head is crowning all over your mantle and all over your walls at your house? No, you have baby pictures of your babies once they're born and they're newborn and they're all cleaned up and they're smiling and they're whatever. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but basically that was the message that he said, that no, you wouldn't do that because it's an incredibly painful experience. You don't want to capture that and send pictures of that around to all of your relatives and everything. And yet there are millions, arguably tens of millions of crucifixes of me, Jesus, of him, Jesus, on the cross, with thorns, crown of thorns and bleeding and everything. And so, we said, no, we're not going to put that in. It's just too upsetting to people, too many people. But that's an example of this notion that you're talking about of, this, whatever is said in the Bible is is the word of God. No, it's, a New Testament was written 50 to 125 years after Jesus died, but passed down by word of mouth to people where the population, 85 to 99% of the population was illiterate. So,
Yeah. Next question is, the 30th November talk brings enormous clarity to topics as diverse as monotheism, free will versus karma or dharma. What do you think is a realistic period of time for these important ideas to experience worldwide or widespread uptake?
Oh boy, that's the gajillion-dollar question. It's more than $1 million question. Yeah, who knows? I have a very personally, if you're asking me, this is my personal, this is Kelvin Chin talking. This is completely, you know, on the record, off the record, or whatever you want to call it. I'm saying this to you on the record, but it's just my opinion, is what I'm saying. I have a long view of humanity. All right, my memories go back 6,000 years. George's. I'm just gonna a little preview, a little sneak preview. I'm not going to say what, but George has a book coming out, and it's going to be coming out soon, in the next, I don't know, within the next 4 to 6 months or something like that. Let's just say his memories go back 50 to 150,000 years. He's not exactly sure. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mine go back 6,000 years so far. All right? So we have a long view on humanity. We're talking about planet Earth now, okay? I also have a experience on another planet that I'll talk about in my book. Brief experience, brief memory, long experience probably, but brief memory. The point is, have we seen improvement in humanity over those, in my case, 6,000 years? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Do I see a turnaround in humanity in my lifetime that some people are probably wishing and hoping for, to the degree that this person is asking the question about? No. But am I discouraged by that? Absolutely not. That's the thing. You got to understand, you guys don't know me, most of you don't know me, since my 20s. In my 20s, I became a very, I don't know what the word is, but I'm losing, the adjectives are escaping me, but maybe you can come up with it, Brian. But I was very forward thinking in terms of how I could help humanity. I was very, 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 very positive and very optimistic. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I was very optimistic about how quickly, that's what it was, how optimistic and quickly, those two ideas, how optimistic and quickly I was about turning around humanity. And I really thought that I could change people. When I'm not exactly sure when the shift happened in me, like 30s, 40s or something like that. Probably 40s. When a shift happened to me, when I realized that I cannot change people, because it took me about 15 to 20 years of banging my head against the wall trying to change people, realizing that I couldn't. That when I realized that I could not change people, but I could influence people. I can influence and change people who want my help in changing themselves. That I couldn't change them, but they have to change themselves, and that I could be instrumental in helping them change themselves. The freedom, I cannot tell you the freedom within myself that happened. The freedom the burden, in other words, to say it opposite way, the burden on me that was relieved and released by having, in a sense, I guess somewhat consciously, but very much unconsciously, burdened myself with for thousands of years, including this lifetime in my 20s, that I was somehow responsible for helping humanity and changing them to move in a positive direction. When that changed, boy, freedom.
Yeah, I want to interject this because I don't want to make this about me, but when you said that, it brought up this memory of me being raised as a Christian and being raised to believe that everybody that wasn't a Christian was going to hell, put me on a mission. It's like my job to save everyone. And anyone that's been raised with that is, if you take that seriously, That's a heavy burden to carry.
It
And
is.
same thing with me. When I realized that everyone is saved, I don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's like everybody, when I started really getting my mind around, and I'd say probably, I've been doing this for 50 years, so I'm trying to help people fast forward, learn from my mistakes, as they say.
Right.
I can't, I can't guarantee that that's going to happen, but that's my intent. Is to share myself. I self-disclose a lot about my weaknesses and my thinking and how it's changed and so forth. I'm guessing somewhere in the last 20 years, fairly recently, 20 years, a major shift has occurred for me in the last 20, 25 years to this really embracing or getting my mind around, and just not just mentally, but viscerally, understanding, but not intellectually, just intellectually understanding, but viscerally, emotionally accepting this whole notion of free will, that everybody has free will, and it has freed me up. I cannot tell you. It's just, I didn't realize the burden that I was carrying that you just described. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Next question is from Marlene. She says, "What is the new role of Jehovah?"
Jehovah's role is the same, except that he's still influencing, and he's still helping, and so forth and so on. Jehovah and our friends are more focused, however, on the other side right now, is what we're hearing, is that because the other side is in so much need of the notion of free will, understanding the notion of free will and non-divinity worship, that they feel like they've planted enough seeds on this side so that we can go out. I'm a seed planter, so I'm planting seeds with all of you, and my hope is that some of you, it depends on what your choice is, but some of you will take some of the seeds that we are planting and in your minds, and that you will share it with others, and so forth and so on. So they feel pretty much, Jehovah and others feel pretty much, that they've planted enough seeds on this side. It's not just me and George and you guys, there's lots of others. Now they're spending a lot of their time on the other side. So what does that tell you about going to a medium or even having a direct communication yourself with the other side? If they feel that the other side is even in more need than Earth about helping shift their belief systems more towards free will and giving people the notion of making their own decisions, that tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Ted asks, "What is being enlightened, and what does enlightenment have to do with the 30th talk?"
So the notion of enlightenment that's been, most people think of enlightenment as the state of perfection. Cannot make mistakes, only do right action, don't need to grow anymore. You've reached a state of perfection. That's the simple definition of enlightenment, whether you're talking about Buddhism or in Hinduism, the Vedic tradition, et cetera, whatever tradition you want to talk about. Okay, so that idea was an idea that was born about 10,000 years ago by this group, the movement that we've talked about. But they now view that as a misunderstanding and a mistake, you could call it. So now they explain the experience of connection not as a merging of oneself with some cosmic soup, or they call it the absolute. Kelvin calls it the cosmic soup, but the absolute or oneness or God or love or fill in the blank. People will use different phrases of merging once they reach perfection. And so the notion now is that we are continually growing, because the idea of perfection means you don't grow anymore. That's what perfection means. And then you're static, that there's no more growth, and that's why they had to come up with this idea of merging, that you merge into some some oneness thing. Well, the reality is, the experience is that nobody, Jesus, Paramahansa, Yogananda, Maharishi, Babaji, name all the gurus that you can think of, and Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, who is the Shankaracharya of the northern seed of the, if you know how honorific that's a huge thing in India and the Indian Vedic tradition. He was the northern seat chair, they're all retain their individuality. Nobody merges and loses their individuality. Merging is not connection. So in my classes, I make a huge distinction, and this is, again, George didn't have time to get into this so much because he ran out of time on the 30th of November. So I've been extrapolating and explaining this much more detail. But connection is not merging. The feeling of connection is connection. It doesn't mean you lose your individuality. The feeling of merging with another being or beings or people or communities or whatever you want to say. The feeling is a feeling. It is not actual merging. Merging means you lose your individuality. You don't know who you are. You have no experience anymore. That's what merging means, okay? So they're saying that there is no more merging, and so this idea of enlightenment is incorrect. It was a misinterpretation, okay, of an experience, a genuine experience of incredible connection. Right?
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. A little humor here from Jody. She said, Jehovah violated the prime directive by interfering with the natural evolution of humanity. A little Star Trek humor, but it's true. He pretended he was God.
Yeah, and you know what, Jody? If you take my Afterlife series, he asked me to put a slide in my Afterlife series, which I cannot quote now. I don't have it up right now with me. But anyway, he has a quote, basically, that says kind of what you just said. He said... I can't remember. It's something like I'm gonna butcher it now, but the idea is something like, don't fall in. He didn't say fall in love again. This is Kelvin Chin linguistics. I can't use Jehovah linguistics. But anyway, it's something like don't fall in love with yourself too much. With your blind following of somebody because I learned the lesson the hard way. Basically, he didn't. This is not what he said, but the quote is in the PowerPoint slide in my Afterlife series, and that's where he puts the dangerous word in.
Yeah. Well, I think this comes back to the idea that we think of these beings, these personalities, as inerrant and infallible and capable of committing a mistake. And and I know that you've talked about this before, and George talked about it. Jehovah used the word lied. It's like it was with good intention, but he misrepresented himself.
He misrepresented. And I think the word lie is a little strong, but I understood it. And it took me a while. I called George we talked about it afterwards face to face, and then I called him like a month. I'd say, can you explain that to me again, the lie thing? So it took me a while to get my mind around what he meant by that. But it was just that Jehovah didn't tell the other members of this small core group of the movement, that he was going to, the real reason he was going off to Mesopotamia region to start this prophetic approach with the Abrahamic, whole thing and so forth in the Old Testament. The reason he started that because he started seeing the karma and dharma idea going south and creating lots of suffering. He started seeing it. He started seeing the beginnings of it, and now it's like a mess. Karma and dharma, it works. That's a classic example of people use karma. Oh, Kelvin, you're people will say this to me. Some of my friends who still believe in this karma idea say, Kelvin, you're getting all this, good karma. Yeah, but the implication is that, if you don't do this, then you're getting bad karma, or you're doing bad stuff, you get bad karma, and this is an accounting system. And there is no accounting system. But now people have gotten so far down the road, they feel like, I've done so many bad things. There's no way I can. So why even bother to try to be a good person anymore? They'll suffer, or it'll encourage them to continue going down the bad road because they feel helpless. No, you can always change your path. That's the bottom line. Karma dharma. So that's why Jehovah went, and so he didn't tell them that he saw it going south. That's what he calls that his lie.
And it's interesting as I listen to the talk because it explains some of these things like karma, dharma. Once you've gotten into, again, the Christian faith where it's like one strike and you're out. You have one life and you're eternally damned. Karma, dharma looks pretty good. So we went too far to the other extreme and said it's all about what you do in this one lifetime. And then Paul said it's all about what you believe about Jesus.
Right.
Which is
Right.
arguably worse than even the karma dharma thing.
Right. Yes. That's why Jehovah came up with the one life thing. And he did mention the word sin. And so it was trying to get people on board. Okay, just focus on one life. Even though he knew all about all this reincarnation and past life stuff, because all these people are coming back to recycling. He's recycling prophets, basically. In the Old Testament, he's recycling. The same group is coming back as Joe Schmo, and now it's coming back as whatever. Prophet so-and-so and prophet so-and-so. It's the same souls recycling. But he said, no, I'm just going to focus the humans on one life. So they can focus, because humans just all over the map at the time, just unfocused. Yeah.
I think this question's already been answered. We're way behind because the questions came in a while ago. But Marlene asks, is prayer only useful to turn within and to comfort ourselves? And I think you've kind of talked about the purpose of prayer, but you might want to reiterate that just in case.
Well, the summary point is that I think prayer, I see prayer as two different things. Prayer of turning within. So in a sense, you could say I teach people to pray, but I don't want to make what I do sound religious, because connecting with oneself to me is prayer. And Jesus talked about seek the kingdom of heaven within. So that's what he meant when he was with us, and we would close our eyes with him and we would pray. But seek the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven within is our own mind. That's what he was saying. Okay? So it's been taken out of context and so forth in the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what he meant. So he was teaching us to pray. Keep in mind, Jesus didn't need to learn how to meditate. He didn't need to go to India. He's with all the people who are teaching meditation for thousands of years before he was Jesus. All right? So it's like this whole notion, people wonder, where was he? Where was he? Was he? And by the way, there are some people I know, people who unnamed, they'll be more public when they're ready to be public, who remember being with Jesus when Jesus was a teenager and in his 20s, okay? So people think the lost years. It's the lost years because it's not in the Bible. Doesn't mean that he wasn't around and people weren't seeing him every day and experiencing him, okay? So anyway, but the other avenue of prayer is asking for stuff. And so we've already talked about that, right? So I view prayer in those two ways, and people can do whatever, I choose to view prayer in the initial way, turning within, connecting with myself in the universe, et cetera, in that way.
But you also touched on asking a friend for help. And I think that's a great idea, a great way of looking at prayer. And it doesn't have to be Jehovah. It could be, as you said, it could be your grandmother. It could be
I call you up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Erica asked a question I think is really interesting. Is George also talking about this anywhere too? It's been 8 years, I think, since we've seen George talk about it publicly. Is he doing what you're doing now?
Great question. So the short answer is no, and but he will be. And so, yeah, for personal reasons, George has waited until next year, in a few months. He'll be more public. You'll see and hear him being more public about all of this 30th November talk. If you go on the Commonwealth Club, he's chair of the humanities section of the Commonwealth Club. That's why I've spoken at the Commonwealth Club. He got me in I got a Monday noon spot, which nobody wanted, because Monday noon, who's going to come to a Monday noon lecture? But I had a full house there. But just it happened. People wanted to hear about death and dying, so the room was full. But most people don't want a Monday noon lecture. But he's the guy who handles scheduling all that, and he interviews. So if you go on the Commonwealth Club, you'll hear him talking about some of the ideas in 30th November without saying it's 30th November and without talking about Jehovah, Jesus, and John the Baptist and everything. Mm-hmm. So you'll see, if you go back to Commonwealth Club and you look at some of the lectures he has given there himself, and or at another organization called Humanities West, you'll see that he's on the board of directors of, where he has spoken at times. You'll see him planting breadcrumbs. That's all I'll say. Reveal right now. But just be patient. Whoever asked that question, and he'll be talking more. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Jody asked a good question. What is an angel, and why do you always use that term?
So when it's a great question, Jody, because people use the word angel in different ways. I'm using angel. Let me define the term. So I use angel as beings who are on the other side, who've never been incarnated in physical form before. That's how I use the word angel. Some people use the word angel to mean any kind of being on the other side, which could be my dead mother and father who are on the other side. You could view them as your guardian angel, or I could view them as my guardian angels or whatever. People will use the term more broadly like that. That's just how I'm using it. I use it as more as beings who've never been incarnate. They're disincarnate, but never been in a physical biological.
Yeah, and there's a whole theology about angels too.
Exactly.
Some people believe that angels don't have free will, and angels are messengers from God, and
Exactly,
stuff like
all
that.
of that. So my experience. So in my afterlife series, actually, which those of you who are in my afterlife series, reminder, session 5 is going to be this Sunday, and I'm going to talk about my experience with angels and how they came to me in 1986 spontaneously and all that. My experience to that last point you just mentioned, Brian, and we'll go to the next question, is that every mind is a mind, including angels. So they have free will. Every mind has free will, including the angels. So the whole notion that angels don't have free will, that they may choose to take orders from some higher level up angels. That's a choice. That's like saying the soldiers in the U.S. Army don't have free will. Yes, they do. Are they taking orders from their superiors? Yeah. Do they have free will though? Yes, they could make a different choice. Might they get punished in the army for making a difference? Yes. But could they? Yes, their consciousness could. Same thing with angels. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I could go on about that, but I'll let that. We'll go to the next one. Marlene asks, "What about prayers of gratitude?" And I think George addressed this in the 30th talk.
What about gratitude?
What about prayers of gratitude?
Oh, prayers of gratitude. There's nothing wrong with prayers of gratitude. There's nothing wrong with prayers. I'm not an anti-prayer person. Okay,
right.
I'm an anti-begging person, I guess. I mean, but because I'm more about let's empower ourselves and strengthen ourselves from within, so we don't have to be begging, but asking for help or giving thanks. Sure, what's wrong with that? Nothing.
So this brings up a question. What level of influence do these minds, these beings, have over the physical world?
What do you mean? Manipulating physical world or giving us ideas?
Manipulating physical world. Like we pray to be healed of cancer or,
there's no answer to the question other than can they influence that? Yes. To what degree? It depends. That's the accurate answer. Okay.
That's a good answer. Yeah, because I think again, people, as you talked about earlier, it's like we think we're asking omnipotent being for something, and if we don't get it, that means that being said no. That being doesn't care about us.
Right.
So that's the conclusion that people draw if this being is omnipotent. So I think that's an important distinction to understand.
Yeah, I mean, just think of it like, I want a new arm. My arm got amputated. I want a new arm. I'm praying to God so that I can get a new arm. I want to grow a new arm. And then does a new arm grow? I don't think that's going to happen again,
Yeah, and it's interesting because we don't pray for that. We don't pray for a new arm because we know that's not going to happen. So
anyway, yeah.
And another question for you: how did you meet George Hammond in this lifetime, and when did you realize he was Andrew, your brother? And then I'll ask the next question after that.
Yeah. So I met George in 1970. Was it 71? Yeah, 71, fall 71. And I'll tell you guys a funny story. So we were both at Dartmouth College. I was a junior. He was a freshman. And I went to a couple of football games my freshman year, but now I'm a junior. I'm not going to football. I'm not really in. But, there's a big deal. Okay, Dartmouth, the football game going on, and you can hear the screaming, the yelling. It was a Saturday. I think they played them on Saturdays, I think, whatever it was. Saturday, let's say, afternoon, 2 o'clock. And I'm looking out my dorm room at 212 Wheeler Hall, second floor. I'm looking out, and I see this Frisbee going up and down and going up and down. And by the trajectory of the Frisbee, I could tell just by looking at the Frisbee. I couldn't see the person. I could tell the person was playing Frisbee with himself. So I looked out the window. Sure enough, it's this guy playing Frisbee. So I just yelled down to him. I didn't know him. And I said, hey, you want somebody to play Frisbee with? And he said, yeah, come on down. So I went down. That's how I met George. Okay. And we played Frisbee together. And we went and played tennis, I think he said. He reminded me we played tennis down right after that, later that afternoon. I introduced him to meditation at Dartmouth, to TM, Transcendental Meditation. I introduced him to his TM teacher, who I'd already been working with. I was not a meditation teacher at the time. I was just organizing and giving lectures, introductory lectures and so forth to students and faculty and members of the New Hampshire community there. But and then we taught meditation together and so forth over in Asia together, and etc. And he knew Maharishi Mahesh Yogi very well, as did I, this lifetime. So we spent a lot of time together on TM meditation courses, those 10 years that, as you guys know, I was involved with the TM organization back in the 1970s, and they went off in a different direction, and I went in a different direction from them. But George and I have been friends ever since. When I found out that he was my brother Andrew, when I flipped over on my back on a TM course during a group meditation, and I was being crucified upside down, and I didn't know who I was. And previously, I had this dream about 6 or 8 months earlier that I hadn't told him about yet, where I was lying in a ditch, and I was really upset, and I was crying and so forth. And so, during a walk after lunch, after I'd been lying on my back, just flipping over energetically, spontaneously, without any, I wasn't even thinking. My body just flipped over by itself, like I get this energy rush. And I was lying on my back on the foam mattress while we were doing these group meditations over in Switzerland. I went on for a couple of weeks at that point, feeling like I was being crucified upside down. George and I went for a walk after lunch, and I started to tell him my dream I said, George, I had this really upsetting dream 6 to 8 months ago. I haven't told you about this. He said, oh yeah, and you were lying and he told me my dream. He said, you were lying in the ditch, and this is what you were wearing, and you were crying all. I said, what? How did you know this? And so he said, that's because I found you. I was your brother Andrew. So that's how that happened. Yeah.
Yeah. And the next question, and I'm going to have to wrap up in probably 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
So I know this is fascinating stuff, and we could probably do this for 3 or 4 hours.
If people want to do it again, they can send me an email, and they say if we got enough people who want to ask more questions that haven't been asked, then we can do another session.
That sounds awesome. But I think this is a great question too. Could you tell us a bit about the Jesus Project and why it was considered a failure? They said it showed us the value of friendship, loving without judgment, etc., which are valuable examples.
Absolutely. So it was considered a failure, not in the way that person asked that question. It was a beautiful way that they captured that, because it was successful in that way. All right, it was very successful in that way. Yeah, but I see the chat box. People can say if they want to do this again, just send Brian a chat message or something. We can continue this Q&A another time. But it was considered a failure, as George said, and the movement and Jesus has said. It was a failure because John the Baptist, the soul plan on the other side, before we all incarnated that lifetime 2,000 years ago, Jehovah's plan was to send John the Baptist down. Remember, John was the prophet Elijah, right? Who was reincarnated as John the Baptist. So the plan was to send John down and start warming people up. And he started doing this baptism thing and baptizing people thinking about more inwardly and so forth. And then, but then he got beheaded, right? By Herod? That's his name, right? Herod, I got the name right.
Yes, Herod of Antipas.
Yeah. Herod and King Herod and his wife, Herod's wife, for some reason, you know the story better than I do, Brian, whatever, said, I want his head on a platter, whatever. Okay, so John the Baptist was killed. Now, before he was killed, fortunately, he met Jesus. And I remember sitting on a big, huge boulder. This is one of my memories. On the side of the hillside, dusty, like very very desert-like, very arid. But there was a river coming through, and there was a kind of a canyon. It was a long road, I don't know, 100, 200, 300 people lined up. And John, Andrew and I were students of John at the time, John the Baptist, and John was baptizing. And then afterwards, John told us we didn't see the moment when, I didn't see the moment when this happened. I was just sitting on a rock watching this, from a couple 100 feet away. But evidently, Jesus was one of the people in line, and he came down and he got baptized by John. And I'm getting a little emotional telling you this. And John said he saw Jesus' eyes and he saw who he was. He saw his soul. They sold a soul. They saw it. And he recognized. Now, keep in mind, they're distant cousins, but they didn't hang out together. Their mothers were cousins. John the Baptist's mother was Elizabeth, who was Mary Hammond. Those may George didn't say this. A little preview, peek behind the curtain. George's sister Mary, who died in the 30th November, gave George, the precursor to the download and everything. Mary Hammond was Elizabeth in a previous lifetime, John the Baptist's mother. She was cousins with Jesus's mother, Miriam, or Mary. We say Mary anglicized, okay? Miriam, who was Jesus's mother, and Elizabeth were cousins. So George's sister was cousins with Jesus's mother, okay? Anyway, so the project went south, obviously. They were supposed to work jointly, John the Baptist and Jesus, and then Jesus got crucified. That's why it's considered a failure, because the overcoming the fear of death was the primary focus of that project, with the John the Baptist Jesus Project, what we call the Jesus Project now. And overcoming the fear of death, teaching people that there's nothing to fear, teaching people that there is something about, past lives and resurrection was real. Jesus tried to use his death that he knew he was going to die. He knew he was going to get killed at some point. He didn't know exactly when, but he knew it was imminent. And he planned it out. He used that to come back, and some of you may have been there and saw him. I feel emotional right now. And saw him because he saw thousands of people. After he died, he came back and he appeared to thousands of people after he died to try to help promote this idea of overcoming the fear of death, this idea that the soul continues after and so forth and can come back in another lifetime. So it's considered a failure because it only lasted for 3-4 years. That's the thing, right? And it didn't really even happen in the way that it was supposed to happen, because John the Baptist's group was supposed to join up with Jesus' group and so forth. I talk about this in my Afterlife series in more detail, but that's the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and it's fascinating that because it only lasted 3.5 years, that so much of Jesus' influence still ripples 2,000 years later, but it was corrupted by our friend Paul.
Yes, and it actually is. We ponder in amazement and reflect in amazement sometimes, those of us in the movement, and we think, man, look at how much of Jesus' teachings actually did survive, and it made it into the Bible. How did that happen? With Paul, just upsetting the apple cart and just derailing the whole Jesus' teaching. It's still some of it crept into the Bible, and probably through, the Apostle John, who was very close to Jesus. But again, John was long dead, and we were all dead, by the time but the verbal stories were passed down, and some of them made it in, notwithstanding the lack of printing presses and, 90-something% of the population being illiterate, et cetera, et cetera. So we are amazed.
I want to summarize. Jody's got a lot of questions. I want to kind of summarize some of his questions. So Jehovah.
Yeah, I'm gonna get my. You asked me. I forgot to bring my power cord over. Go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. So if Jehovah, messed this thing up, and Jehovah wants us now to know that, hey, I'm not really this omnipotent being that you think I am, and this is the truth. Why doesn't Jehovah appear like in the flesh, or why doesn't Jehovah appear to like the church leaders or something, instead of speaking through you guys?
Bottom line is he's tried to, and they're not open. That's the bottom line. Did you hear me? Oh, uh-oh. What happened? I just plugged in my power. Did I go?
Okay.
Did I go silent for a minute?
You went radio silent for a second.
All
So
right.
I want to kind of summarize some of the things that
I heard that. So
Okay.
I was
Okay.
answering. So the
Okay.
bottom line is, he's been trying to communicate with lots of people, not just Christians, but others. And the Dalai Lama actually got the message about ending the whole Dalai Lama thing. You go on the Dalai Lama website, he ended. George had a message from Jehovah and Shankara, actually it was probably from Shankara, to the Dalai Lama. And and George tried to deliver it to the Dalai Lama, could never. George almost got arrested, but because it's like at a Dalai Lama event, that's a whole other story he's going to write about. But the Dalai Lama obviously got the message, because shortly after that, even though George never got him the typewritten message from the movement, the Dalai Lama, we saw it on the website, he ended the whole Dalai Lama thing. No more Dalai Lamas.
Yeah.
And we also have a message for the Pope. So maybe one day George and I might get to deliver it.
And this brings up an example I want to give you. There's a guy I know, his name is Carlton Pearson, who was a extreme evangelical Christian preacher. And he was sitting on his couch one night and looking at these children dying in Africa. And he asked God, why are you sending all these babies to hell? And he got a download and completely changed his faith, went out, stopped preaching eternal hell, started preaching universalism, immediately lost his church. Most of the people, 90% of the people in his church left. He was disowned by the evangelical community. So I think one thing, you have to be open to receiving the message, to answer Jody's question. And the other thing is, are you willing to pay the price?
Exactly. Yeah, and so maybe they're not. And that's and I understand that. And nobody in the movement is here to say that the Pope has to change what he's thinking, blah, blah, blah. We have a message for the Pope from Jehovah. But again, free will, right?
Yeah. Well, the church has a lot invested in the message that they've already got.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, we could probably go on all day, but I do have a deadline this afternoon. Kelvin, this has been fantastic. I hope everyone here has enjoyed it. I know there's a few more questions, but I think we got the flavor of most of them. I'm willing to do this again. People want to do it, so just let Kelvin or myself know.
Yep. So I think in the they can reach me at kelvinchin.org, right? And Brian, you can Google grief to growth, grief the number 2 growth, and then you'll get to Brian's podcast, his websites, and so forth, and you can communicate with Brian that way too. But yeah, we want to do it again. If people are interested, we can continue asking the questions. Yeah.
Awesome. Good seeing you, Kelvin.
Good
Thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks so much.
Don't forget to hit that big red subscribe button, and click the notify bell. Thanks for being here.